The Secrets of Wilder, Yogani. Why not me? John Wilder brushed the sun-bleached hair away from his eyes. The firm autumn wind blew it back again, but he didn't notice. Neither did he notice the steady roar of the surf coming over his shoulder. He sat high on the dune, his elbows resting on his bare raised knees and his head propped in his hands. He was transfixed by the miracle unfolding before him. It came slithering out. John fell on his side in the warm sand, intently watching the quivering creature perched uncertainly on the dead empty shell that clutched the strand of wind-wavering sea oats. It slowly, painstakingly, opened and dried itself in the morning sun. After a while it went up. He rolled on his back, smiling into the blue northeast Florida sky and its living texture of magic sparkling specks. And there it went, the butterfly, fluttering away on great golden wings. His eyes were wide with joy as it flew up, going gradually out of sight. He didn't find a caterpillar changing into a delicate creature of the air very often. But when he did, he'd stop to witness the excruciating beauty of nature unfolding, feeling the fantastic mystery. He wanted to become a butterfly too. So strong was his longing to be transmuted that he made a vow that in this life he would find a way to become much more than a mere human being bound to the earth by this body and these thoughts. He lay face up in the sand pondering his 18 years of humanity. How will I get beyond this? He gazed into the great breathing blue. A deep silence overtook him, enveloped him. His eyes closed slowly. He disappeared from the world. He didn't know where he was. Then he heard the woman's voice, "Come to me." His eyes snapped open. He shot to his feet and looked around. No one in sight. "Who are you?" he called out nervously, looking around the great white mounds guarding the shore. No one was there. He'd been hearing the voice for a few weeks. It came when his longing settled deep inside where he was quiet. The voice seemed to come from inside him. Familiar, but he couldn't place it. Now it was gone again. He sank back onto the sand and into the spiritual hunger that never left him. Audio. After a while he got up, gazing at the massive shuttered Coquina Dame Hotel decaying behind the shelter of the dunes. He turned toward the sea and swooshed playfully down the great sand slope, his feet pointed inward like a slowing skier. He navigated between the clumps of tall blowing grass, looking past the huge surf and endless white caps to the rippling horizon. A hurricane was whirling 200 miles offshore, making its way from the Caribbean to the Carolina Outer Banks, yet another raging beauty passing by the concave coastline of the Jacksonville area. It was clear and sunny here, but the wind gushed in over the horizon, bringing the huge and chaotic sea with it. Its sweet salty mist beckoned him. It heaved rhythmically, tossing its waves on the wide beach, taunting him. John gazed at the sea. "Is it you calling me?" "Nothing but the roar," replied. He threw off his t-shirt and ran into the warm seductive water, diving under a large wave as it curled over him hungrily. Then another, and another. He swam through the first line of waves heading for the outer break where they were 3 times the size. He dove under the walls of foam that came roaring down on him. A dozen dives later he reached the outer break. Tired, he treaded water as he bobbed over swells as big as 2-story houses, on the edge of breaking into boiling oblivion. The shore seemed miles away, his adrenaline pumped with anticipation each time a wave lifted him high into the air. "I'll catch one. I know I can." With a sideways snap of his head he whipped the hair and sea water from his eyes. The salty taste filled him. Then he smiled inwardly like a ski diver about to jump out of a plane with an untested parachute. The impending encounter produced a resonance in him. It was something deeply quiet, yet intensely pleasurable. He lived to become that. Sometimes he felt it in cross-country, when he was dashing for the finish line, on the verge of passing out, fighting to win again. He'd lose track of everything, even his body, yet be more alive inside than at any other time. It was a dying that filled him with life. He was here challenging the sea to send him there. When the next towering swell approached, he swam like mad to catch it. Catch it he did, a second too late. The tip of the wave licked the sky, on the edge of climax, and he was still on top instead of long gone down the slope heading for a survivable ride out front. It would have been better if he had been a few more seconds late. Then he'd only have to contend with the turbulent backwash behind the wave. No, he'd caught this one just wrong. He knew it as soon as he hadn't made the slope, finding himself on top with no place to go but into the abyss with tons of churning water falling in behind him. He'd never been in this situation on a wave this big. He knew to curl up in a ball with his head between his knees and arms wrapped around his shins. He hoped he wouldn't hit the bottom too hard. When a wave crests it gets shallow in front, even this far out, and that is where he would land. He took his last breath and balled up as he and the water plummeted together. It was like going over Niagara Falls, minus the barrel, thunk, whoosh. He hit bottom on his back. Half his air got away. He tumbled wildly. He kept his head tucked and hugged his shins in a death grip. He hung on to his remaining air. He'd need it until the wave left him behind, and maybe for the next one that could hit him when he came up. It seemed like the thrashing currents went on for hours. His lungs were burning for air. Somehow he drew strength from the urgent sensation. It was a phenomenon he discovered in running, how a shortage of air could bring a mysterious energy from deep within him. But no pondering it now, except to be thankful that it was saving him from drowning. When he came up in the trail of light foam behind the departed wave, he was staring at another monster coming over him like a hungry predator. He gulped air and went down, back into the ball, splattering on the bottom as the whole Atlantic Ocean crashed down on him. His ball came apart. The air was mashed out of him. He was dazed, disoriented, on the verge of blacking out. Would this be it? Should he breathe in the great sea and become one with all of life? He saw a light and instinctively swam toward it. He broke the surface into the air, gasping an in-breath. If another wave had hit him then, he'd have been gone for sure. He took a few desperate breaths and then looked around. He was in a lull, nothing but a thin trail of foam between him and the safety offshore. He could make it if he went now. He turned back out. He could see the mountainous swells coming at him from far out. It was an easy decision. He went straight out toward them. He fought his way under a string of giant waves to get back to the outer break. He was aching, raw, exhausted. But finally he got there and was being lifted high over the tops of the huge walls of water again, ready to try again. This was all that mattered. Audio. He summoned all his breath. "I'm going to ride one of you if it kills me," he cried, waving his fist at the endless procession of mammoths rolling in toward him from the hurricane over the horizon. One arrived soon enough. His arms and legs felt like rubber as he flailed to catch it. This time he managed to get in front of it, but not too far. He hit it just right and came down the giant slope head first, arms trailing on his sides, screaming all the way, "Yee-hee-hea." The wave exploded, burying him in white behind the leading edge of the roaring water. He maintained his board-like posture. He knew he had it. He could feel himself skidding down the hill under the foam. Then his head and shoulders popped out, established in front of the white conflagration and flying toward the beach. When he and the wave approached the inside break, the wave slowed and he started swimming again, catching it as it broke for the second time, much smaller by now. Harrowed it all the way to the beach, stopping short on the firm sand like a fighter jet landing on an aircraft carrier. He rolled on his back, exhausted, as the remnants of the great wave receded past his beaten body, sucked back into the sea. He spread his arms and legs out wide in the wet sand and started to laugh, shaking all over. Wee-wee. Still laughing, John got up and staggered toward his shirt. 6 middle-aged walkers were gathered there. They'd been watching the crazy kid getting pounded by the wild surf 100 yards out. Their apparent leader, a man in Bermuda shorts with a large sunburned belly and Panama hat, came up to him. "Are you all right, son? We were about to go for help." John grinned. "Oh yeah, I'm okay." He turned toward the sea, squinting with a slight cock of his head, and then slowly back to the man. "Some surf, huh? Looks dangerous out there. Did you know what you were doing?" John shook his head hard, blubbering his lips and slinging water on the man's reddish feet. "Just barely." He wiped his face with his shirt. Then he started jumping up and down on one foot with his head tipped to get the water out of his ear. Drops of salty sea fell to the sand from his shaggy hair. "The ride, was it worth the risk?" the man asked. "For me? Yeah. There's something in it besides the ride." "Like what?" The man took off his hat, scratched his bald head, and quickly covered it again. John looked up at the blazing sun and then into the man's sunglassed eyes. "It's hard to explain, sir. It's a kind of inner opening. A going beyond." "Going beyond? Beyond what? Don't you think there could be more than what we are seeing here?" As the words came out, John made a slow wide gesture with an outstretched arm, encompassing the land and the sea. The men followed John's hand. Well, no. I don't think so, son. John's arm hung in the air for a second, like an unfinished sentence, and then dropped to his side. It splat against his soggy cutoffs. His facial expression also hung in the air a few more seconds. Anyway, that's why I was out there. He pulled on his shirt, gave the men, the woman behind him and the two other touristy-looking couples a wet salty salute, and took off trotting north along the waterline in his pigeon-toed way. As he sped up, his hands opened loosely, and his fingers began flicking downward conspicuously with each accelerating step. He sure didn't look like a high school state champion cross-country runner. But that's what he was, 2 years in a row. The walkers watched him go. That short wiry teenager who gave himself to the raging sea, came out laughing, spouted a few mystic bits and trotted off like that. After a minute, he was but a dot on the shore as Hespeed away. Audio, the house was 3 miles up the beach, near the north end of Coquina Island. The sun was high in the sky. Morning had yielded to midday. The wild surf and steady northeast wind clothed the shoreline in a thin luminous mist. John ran through the white sun-drenched moisture, his slender legs slicing through the mounds of foam that were scattered on the beach. The exhilaration of the surf and the exertion of running made him feel bigger inside, never mind the pain. Maybe if I run hard enough I can burst from this body that confines me. I'll try. He ran faster on the hard wet sand, and faster, after all, if a caterpillar can do it. By the time he got home he was breathing hard and shining with sweat. As he came up the long wooden walkway over the dunes, he heard a shout, "Hey, Squirt, where you been? Kurt? You back from Florida State already?" John called. "You just left last week." Kurt Wilder stood among the palms at the top of the faded wooden steps leading up the big dune to the veranda in front of the house. He had one hand on each rail, blocking John's path. "Not again," John said as he trudged up the stairs. "Just like old times," Kurt said. "It'll cost you $1 to get through." "I don't have $1. Do I look like I have $1? John held out his arms, revealing all he had on him was one pair of wet cutoffs and one weedy gray t-shirt with a fading Duval High Cross Country on the front. "Even if I had $1, what makes you think I'd give it to a moron like you?" "Hey, screw you." Kurt stood his ground. He was 4 years older and 6 feet tall, nearly half a foot taller than his younger brother. John went up the stairs toward Kurt. "Seems every time I come up these steps, he's waiting for me." When he got to the top, he stopped. Kurt had a big grin on his acne-scarred face. "Hi, dreamer." John tried to press through and Kurt gave him a knee, sending him halfway back down the stairs. John came right back up. Kurt released one hand just as he arrived. "Whatcha been doing out here?" John knew Kurt didn't care for the beach or the sea, usually referring to them collectively as out there. Kurt's taste was more for games of conquest, which included chess, Risk, and student politics. "Not much." "Thanks for the free pass," John said as he went by, limping slightly on the knee he banged on the way down the stairs. There was no way he could tell Kurt about the butterfly. He wasn't sure himself why he had such strong and giddy feelings about it. So how was he going to explain it to his pain-in-the-ass big brother? Kurt would just as soon squash the bug, so what would be the point? But to John, it meant everything. The changing. It filled him with wonder. As John headed to the house, and the solitude of his room, he wondered why he got so worked up about something as simple as a butterfly. Why did such things attract him so strongly? His life seemed to be about breaking through to something. But what? He was more concerned about himself than the butterfly, or Kurt. His strongest interests were limited to what even he considered dubious. He loved pondering his nebulous inner possibilities, and indulged himself freely in that. He knew his parents were concerned. So was he. It was his senior year and he had no plans. What's wrong with me? And that voice, that woman calling inside me. Who is she? By the time he crossed the lawn between the house and the pool, Kurt had caught up. "Wanna go swimming?" "No thanks." Kurt's idea of swimming was wallowing in the pool like a manatee, vomiting business and politics. "Gotta go. See you later." John was in the side door of the sprawling weather-beaten cedar-shingled house and heading up the creaking back stairs 3 at a time. He traversed the long musty hall on the 3rd floor, went into his room and shut the door. The skeleton key lock clicked. It was here that he had his most exciting adventures. Hey, screw you. Kurt stood his ground. He was 4 years older and 6 feet tall, nearly half a foot taller than his younger brother. John went up the stairs toward Kurt. Seems every time I come up these steps, he's waiting for me. When he got to the top, he stopped. Kurt had a big grin on his acne-scarred face. Hi, dreamer. John tried to press through and Kurt gave him a knee, sending him halfway back down the stairs. John came right back up. Kurt released one hand just as he arrived. Whatcha been doing out there? John knew Kurt didn't care for the beach or the sea, usually referring to them collectively as out there. Kurt's taste was more for games of conquest, which included chess, Risk, and student politics. Not much. Thanks for the free pass, John said as he went by, limping slightly on the knee he banged on the way down the stairs. There was no way he could tell Kurt about the butterfly. He wasn't sure himself why he had such strong and giddy feelings about it. So how was he going to explain it to his pain-in-the-ass big brother? Kurt would just as soon squash the bug, so what would be the point? But to John, it meant everything, the changing. It filled him with wonder. As John headed to the house, and the solitude of his room, he wondered why he got so worked up about something as simple as a butterfly. Why did such things attract him so strongly? His life seemed to be about breaking through to something. But what? He was more concerned about himself than the butterfly, or Kurt. His strongest interests were limited to what even he considered dubious. He loved pondering his nebulous inner possibilities, and indulged himself freely in that. He knew his parents were concerned. So was he. It was his senior year and he had no plans. What's wrong with me? And that voice, that woman calling inside me. Who is she? By the time he crossed the lawn between the house and the pool, Kurt had caught up. Wanna go swimming? No thanks. Kurt's idea of swimming was wallowing in the pool like a manatee, vomiting business and politics. Gotta go. See ya later. John was in the side door of the sprawling weather-beaten cedar-shingled house and heading up the creaking back stairs 3 at a time. He traversed the long musty hall on the 3rd floor, went into his room and shut the door. The skeleton key lock clicked. It was here that he had his most exciting adventures. It's great, Harry said. We've got a place on the beach on Coquina Island. Stella and the boys love it. You've got sons? Yeah, Kurt's the oldest. He's a business major at Florida State. John's a senior in high school. He's, a runner. But enough about us. How are those pretty daughters of yours doing? Is it true you've got one headed for Harvard? By the time they got to the Big Bend area, it was mid-afternoon and the sky was thickening with showers. The closer they got, the less visibility they had. The rural airstrip they were headed for had no instruments, and Harry had to bring the plane down low to see the ground, too low. He found the Gulf Coast and was heading south, picking his way along, looking for something familiar. Hey, there's the mill. Sam shouted, pointing to the east as it came into view through the rain. The pungent odor of wood pulp processing filled the plane and their nostrils. It smells like money, doesn't it? Sure does, Harry said. But we're too far south. The strip's a few miles north of here. He banked the plane inland around the pulp mill and they headed north. The rain thickened. By now, they were just a few hundred feet above the ground. Harry figured they'd see the strip and bean ding in a minute. Now, somewhere around here, look out. Sam yelled, oh shit. Harry turned hard right. The aircraft banked away, whining like a dive bomber as it peeled right in the severe turn. They missed the Macro Tower by a few feet. Harry got the plane leveled just as they skimmed the tops of the pines. He pulled hard on the yoke and brought them up. Finally, he turned to Sam. That was close. You're not kidding. Sam was white, and the sweat was running down his temples. Let's get this damn thing on the ground. The airstrip came into view through the rain and Harry touched down as smooth as he could on the weed-infested asphalt. Despite the rough start, the pulp mill visit was a success, and Wilder Corp got the Alabama project. But Sam flew commercial from then on. Audio. Harry and Stella were moving into the upper echelon of Jacksonville society. The big 100-year-old cedar shingled house on the wooded dune overlooking the ocean suited them well. It was a far cry from their first little hole in the wall in Brooklyn, New York all those years ago. The 5-acre property was covered with live oaks and palms. A long driveway wound up the hill from Beach Road. They were proud of their boys. Harry wanted them both to join Wilder Corp after college, and eventually take over. Both had worked part-time summer jobs there since they were 16. It all seemed too perfect. Dinner. Stella called as she put the food on the big oak table in the kitchen. Pot roast. My favorite. Kurt came in and took his seat. He was home from school for the weekend and was enjoying the nostalgic meal even before he dug in. He'd long since gotten his weight under control, and could afford it now. Harry came in from the study. Where's our athlete? Oh, runner boy is locked in his room again, Kurt said. That boy. Will you get him, Kurt? Stella said. She was admiring the symmetry of the table she had set. Mom. Kurt complained. Go on. The climb'll do you good, Harry said as he stabbed a slab of pot roast. Kurt went into the foyer and hollered up to the 3rd floor through the center of the spiraling banisters. John. He listened. No answer. John. Still no answer. Shit. Kurt began to climb, hollering John, every few steps on the way up. By the time he was about to start up the last flight leading to the 3rd floor, John appeared on the landing. He looked otherworldly. His eyes were glazed. I'm coming, he said in a voice that was barely present. Thanks, Kurt said. Thanks for what? Thanks for not waiting until I was on the 3rd floor before you came out. John laughed. He was coming back to life, and in good spirits too. I knew I messed up somehow. He bounded down the stairs 4 at a time with his funny gimp, leaving Kurt far behind. Jesus, Kurt muttered as he ambled back downstairs. His jackrabbit brother had always been a mystery to him, and to a lot of people. How could such a weirdo be so fast? During the meal, Harry was quiet. Kurt wasn't sure, but it looked like he had some news or something. Finally he spoke. How are things at school, John? Did you get all the classes you wanted? Yeah, it's not too bad. How does the cross-country team look this year? I've got a challenger. There's a new guy, Jimmy Marcoman, Heat Sunruin. I have to fight to keep ahead of him. He is going to do the mile in spring track too. Coach Johnson tried to get me for the mile last year, but I said no. I'm much better in a long race. Jimmy can do both. Heat amazing. A challenge never hurts, does it? Harry said, no, not at all. John put his head down closer to his plate as he ate, like he knew what was coming next. By now, Kurt knew too. Have you given any more thought to college? Well, I don't know exactly what to do, Dad. To Kurt it looked like John was talking to his mashed potatoes. How do you mean? You're going to keep your grades up this year, aren't you? Yeah, but I'm not sure I want to go to college. No. How will you make a living? I don't know, but I feel there is something else for me, and wrapping myself up in college seems like it will be a distraction. A distraction? A distraction from what? I don't know. Kurt was enjoying this. He could see their father was getting wound up. He watched as Harry took a deep breath. Well, if I understand correctly, you don't want to go to college because you feel it will distract you from you don't know what. Does that make any sense to you, Stella? Stella winced. Well, he just doesn't know what he wants to do yet. Her fearful eyes wanted to leave the room. It looked like she was clutching the chair under her to keep from running. Kurt watched his mother's face writhing with discomfort. Her aversionto conflict disgusted him. She'd do almost anything to avoid it. He'd never let himself be like her. It was her spineless vulnerability that drove him to fight for dominance over whomever he was around. Exactly, Harry said, his voice getting louder. That's why people go to college, so they can find out what they want to do, and be progressing with at least a general education while they are finding out. I don't know what you are going to find out hanging around here, John. Something, John said softly but firmly. Kurt saw he was looking straight at their father now. Something. Yeah, something. Okay, Harry said in an exasperated tone. I'll have to take your word for it, because I don't have an inkling what you're talking about. I know it isn't easy, Dad. Just give me some time. That's what I need right now. Some time to figure things out. I know I need to keep myself available for something. When I know what it is, I will let you know. Okay, son. Harry speared half a dozen string beans and shoved them in his mouth. Stella seemed to shrink. Her perfectly fixed hair and crisp patterned blouse were not protecting her. Her life was based on appearances, and appearances meant nothing at this table. There was a long silence while they ate. Way to go, John, Kurt finally said. You just promised to make something out of nothing. When will you tell us what that something will be? I'm going to be making something leftover for tomorrow if you three don't eat all this. Stella looked proud as she mounted her counterattack on the disharmony that invaded her pristine kitchen. They all took another helping, but Kurt could see the tension between John and their father remained. He knew his mother's extreme fear of disorder, and everyone's awareness of it, was all that was preventing a good knockdown, drag-out at the dinner table. He, on the other hand, thrived on it. Come on, Mom, don't change the subject. I really want to know how to make something out of nothing. Stella started to shrink again. That's enough, Kurt, Harry said. But, Dad, aren't you curious how he eat your dinner? Kurt, Harry said, dodging Stella's burgeoning fear, the tyranny that ruled her life, and gnawed insidiously at the three wilder men as well. All that was left was the clinking of the silverware on the plates as they ate. Audio. Kurt knew that John had a special gift, and that it was somehow spiritual. He knew John was much smarter than he was too, and resented it. He sensed John would do great things. Whatever his something turned out to be, he knew it would be big. He did not have John's spiritual ambitions, if that's what they were, but he was ambitious. He had been one of those students in high school who didn't stand out very much. Back then, his pudginess and acne assured that no one who was anyone wanted to be seen with him, but Kurt was smart enough, and he worked hard. He got good grades and harbored dreams of wealth and power. He was aggressive, enterprising, and ruthless. He had the traits necessary for a successful adulthood in the material world, and he knew it. College had been his coming out, and he was ready to do whatever was necessary to get ahead, but none of this hidden strength made it any easier for him in his awkward youth, and he carried the scars of it. He grew up being teased or ignored, which only strengthened his resolve to control the lives of others. That, and his fear of being a spineless weakling like his mother. Of everyone Kurt knew, John was most decent, the most sincere. He wondered why John put up with him. He was the one person Kurt could pick on while growing up, without fear of retribution. And he was still in the habit, even though they were both grown. John had determination, grace, and humor, an incredible combination that could open doors. It was in his eyes. Even so, Kurt could not resist the temptation to exploit him any way he could, being the enterprising person that he was. It was how he treated everyone. Audio. John's room was his cave, his sanctum, the place where he conducted his deepest thinking and self-discovery. He explored himself fully there, delving into the strange and powerful forces churning in his loins, filling himself with the mysterious energy, exploding into the great all-consuming releases to nothingness. He wasn't sure what these experiences were about except that they were sex. But that hardly explained it. Hardly explained it at all. The feeling seemed bigger and more far-reaching than the simple act of reproduction. At times he felt he was floating off the bed in the midst of his persistent reveries. He was determined to get to the bottom of it. He knew if he continued to explore himself he would eventually find the answer. Since his explorations began to go noticeably deeper the year before, John began to write about his experiences in a big 3-ring notebook that he kept stashed under his bed amidst the rubble of old running shoes, books, and a long-forgotten Tonka truck. The first blue-lined page in the notebook read simply, "The Secrets of Wilder." 100 pages followed, covered with his distinctive scrawl. Little did he know that the 100 pages would turn into thousands, or that the world would be changed by his life and writings. Orgasm, while all-consuming and instinctively mandatory, was not John's favorite thing. It ended the journey within him, at least temporarily. He knew there was more. It was the long pleasuring in front of orgasm that produced the most lasting effect. When he could stay in front for an hour, and then stop, he would find himself filled with peace and an enjoyable luminous sensation for hours afterwards. In such a state, he would practically float out of his room to wherever he was going. He could run like lightning in that state. The trophies on the bookcase were a testamento the secret energy he cultivated. But it wasn't about that kind of winning. When engaged in his practice, as he called it, his eyes would drift upward, coaxing a strange pleasurable current up through him like a golden breath. His tongue would be drawn back on the roof of his mouth. Sometimes his head would shake rapidly from side to side. Often he would become completely lost in the experience, forgetting he had a body at all, losing awareness of his surroundings. He would become thoughtless, nearly breathless, needing nothing, and fully awake inside. He tried to recreate the sensations without physically stimulating himself, in his mind, with his feelings. He reasoned that there might be more ways into it, whatever would take him into that expanded zone of immortal well-being. He craved these experiences. His heart became deeply attached to them. He devoted more and more time to his explorations. The quest consumed him. It was why he ran cross-country so fearlessly, often to the edge of collapse. He took risks that others would not consider. The expansive inner experience was to be found on the edge where everything'll go. Why? He didn't know. He wanted to find out. He wanted to have more control over his daily routine so he could experiment on himself. He knew he would lose it if he went off to college. John was addicted to a powerful drug, his own ecstasy. Each day he worked to extend his bliss states. Is this right? Am I out of control? He felt guilt about what he was doing. But he could not stop. The silent power it gave him was too great, and the pleasure too consuming. He was aware that people could notice a presence emerging in him. He sensed he was on a journey. Is it wrong to seek the source of all that I am? He didn't feel he had a choice. He had to find the way inward. He would learn the secrets of himself, or die trying. He had to know the truth. His need to find the hidden truth in his sexuality overshadowed the longings for a mate that bubbled up in him. Would he ever have a lover? What woman could ever understand his compulsion? His friends were interested in girls, in getting laid, as they put it. He was interested in God. This was the something of John Wilder. But he could tell no one. Not yet. Not until he could put more of the pieces together. Chapter 3. Those eyes. She had on the frumpiest dress she could find. Her hair was pinned up in a bun, and her face was adorned with the thick-rimmed plastic glasses he'd bought at the drugstore a long time ago. Devi Duran imagined herself to be invisible. At 5'2", she felt like she could disappear if she tried hard enough. She wanted to. She held her breath as she entered Duval High, holding her books close to her bosom and praying that she'd somehow be able to conceal the terrible secret that everyone knew, that her mother and brother had been brutally murdered 2 years before. The illusion had succeeded for many months. For the most part, everyone left her alone. They looked on curiously, sometimes sympathetically, and gave her the space she needed. Even so, certain boys looked at her hungrily, for under her disguise an incredible beauty was bound up, and they could see it. They could feel it. She turned her eyes and body away from them. No. All they want is to exploit me. At home, in her room, Devi tried to let herself breathe. First, she let her hair down. It fell off her shoulders in waves of shimmering black. Sheer moved her clothes slowly as she stood in front of the mirror on the closet door. She looked at her exquisite proportions, and the sultry energy buried in her eyes. She ran a hand down her hip. Her light brown skin was soft, on the edge of moist. She remembered what her mother told her shortly before she died: enjoy yourself fully in private, my dear. Your beauty and your light are God-given gifts. Accept no man into your heart but he who will love you until the end of time. When you find him, give to him your soul. In doing so you will save his, and your own. Devi clung to these words. Her mother had been filled with love and compassion, the great-granddaughter of a temple courtesan in India, and skilled in the arts of love. She gave herself to a handsome American merchant marine, Charles Duran, and came to this strange land of contradictions where great promise and deep darkness seemed to mingle on every street corner, and in every heart. Charles went into the tugboat business on the Great St. John's River, and they made their home on Coquina Island. Joe and Devi were born here. When Devi reached puberty, Her mother shared with her the secrets of cultivating inner pleasure, but none of it mattered anymore. Mama was gone, Joe was gone, and Devi was a young woman alone, left with this consuming longing for completeness, and this fear of the world, a world conspiring to destroy all beautiful things. Would she be next to be murdered by the insane, racist lashers? Their sordid family history went back generations to the earliest days of the Ku Klux Klan. Their fixation was on projecting hate and violence toward the mixing of the races, including white and East Indian. The threat hung over Devi like a guillotine. She knew not when it would fall again. But she couldn't give up completely. More than anything, she wanted love. She wanted it more than life. Somehow love would lead her to freedom. Does my lover wait for me? Oh God, please help me find him. A wave of desperate sorrow welled up in her. She began to weep in front the mirror. She wept for her dead mother. She wept for her dead brother. She wept for her father, who was left alone too, and had taken to drink. But, most of all, she wept for herself. The tears dripped down her cheeks onto her body. She needed to be consoled. Her sorrow mingled with her passion. She couldn't prevent her hands from gliding up her hips. She lightly spread the tears across her breasts. She held the sacred talisman hanging around her neck tenderly for a moment. Her mother gave it to her the week before she died. Her hands slid down over her firm belly and then lower. She began a long stirring of the fire that smoldered deep within her. Her eyes went up in lonesome ecstasy. Here she found some comfort. It was the second week of school. John Wilder closed his locker in the noisy corridor at Duval High. He worked his way through the throng of students on his way to his first class, English literature. He went through the chicken wire windowed door and found a seat near the back of the packed classroom. The teacher had not arrived yet, and he sat quietly observing the din. A pen fell on the floor and rolled against his sneaker. As he leaned to pick it up, something hit him hard on the side of his head. Bonk, ow, a sweetly irate feminine voice cried. Halfway bent over, with his hand on his head, he turned and there was Devi Duran, a few inches away, her hand on the side of her head too. I'm sorry, he said as he rubbed his head. Are you all right? What do you think? Her dark eyes flashed through her glasses. He was transfixed for a second. He picked up the pen. I think this is yours. He placed it carefully on the writing board of her chair. I was only trying to help. I know. Her eyes darted away. She was straightening her glasses and still rubbing her head. She looked flustered. I didn't mean to scold you. You didn't scold me. I should have looked before I leaned over. My fault. He peered at her through the noise of the classroom. Her eyes came back, and he got that feeling again. They were like magnets pulling him in. What? She said. He didn't say anything. What? She opened her eyes wide, mocking his gaze. He blinked. Sorry. I do that sometimes. Do what? Stare. Well, not stare, really. Get lost is probably more like it. Oh. You are Devi. Yes, and you are John. He smiled. We meet at last. At last. Yeah, we've been going to this place for years, and we meet at last, and so gracefully too. She smiled. I'm forgiven. For now. Thank God, he said. Their eyes reconnected and he was getting lost again. He wanted to go deeper. But something in her scared him, something unfathomable. He could tell she feared him too, though she now met his gaze with determination. Her eyes reached deep into his soul, seeming to inquire, are you the one? His inclination had always been to go straight into the jaws of his fear. Invariably he ended up better off, though usually for a price. What is she about, this plainly dressed girl in the bun with those eyes behind the glasses that make me want to dive in? Like everyone, he'd heard the story of the death of her mother and brother, and that explained something about her. He wanted to find out more. John watched Mr. Culpepper, tall, tan and disheveled, walk into the chaotic classroom and begin waving his arms. Hello, 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 everyone. When the final rustling faded, he put on a look of deep discontent. Now, will someone please tell me, what are we doing here in August? Doesn't the school board know that summer isn't over yet? Wouldn't you rather be on the beach? Yeah, the class cried in unison. Me too. Well, like it or not, here we are. We shall try and make the best of it. He took a small brown book out of his battered briefcase and wrote 3 lines on the blackboard. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Does anyone know what this is from? Mr. Culpepper said, pointing to it over his shoulder with a chalky hand. A studious-looking Filipino girl in front said, "It's from The Road Not Aiken, by Robert Frost." John didn't hear it. He was absorbed in the 3 lines. That's right, Wendy. Would anyone like to comment on what these words mean? John raised his hand. He rarely did. Yes, John Wilder, in the back. It means that going your own way instead of everyone else's can make all the difference. That's a pretty good answer, Mr. Culpepper said. And that's pretty good advice for all of us. Now maybe, just maybe, this class can be a road less traveled, and maybe it will make all the difference. Whether you walk it or not is for each of you to decide. Yep. John understood that. He knew it applied to every choice in life, to do what others expected or to do what one must, regardless of the consequences. The discussion continued, and John's mind went quiet. He heard and absorbed all that Mr. Culpepper was saying. He liked him because he cared and tried to inspire the students. From time to time, he'd look over and get caught in Devi's eyes again. She seemed to know what he was feeling as she gave him looks that reached deep into him, moving him inexplicably. Few, but more than anything, he was in his silence, the place from where he watched all things, the place from where he directed his unconventional fledgling life. He did not know exactly what this place in him was, but he knew he could not be touched there, and this is what enabled him to walk through his fear. Whatever it was that gave him this separateness, this independence, even from those beautiful eyes sitting next to him, he wanted more of it. He didn't mind appearing to be a bit detached at times. He didn't expect to be in 2 places at once, at least not yet. Before John knew it, class was over and he was gathering up his notes and getting ready to leave. He turned to Devi. "Are you going upstairs?" "Yes, I'm in your history class too, remember?" She gave him a what? "Are you a dope?" "Look, may I walk with you?" he said, "only if you promise not to whack me in the head again." "Cross my heart," he said, making the gesture. They went out through the mob of milling students and up the well-worn stairs at the end of the corridor. When Devi got home that afternoon, the first thing she did was dive into her closet. The uninteresting clothes came flying out over her shoulder, scattering onto the bedroom floor behind her. She was looking for something she could wear the next day, something nice, not too inviting, but definitely not unflattering. As she rummaged, she began to hum a tune to a song she and her mother used to sing together on the back porch as they watched boats pass by on the Intracoastal Waterway. They called them snowbird boats, because they were northerners cruising south for the winters and north for the summers. Then she let out a laugh. She realized she was happy, actually happy, for the first time since that fateful day 2 years ago. Am I finally coming back to life? She found 2 outfits that would be acceptable until she could get to the store for more, and moved them to the front of the rung in the closet. She gathered the rest off the floor and threw them all toward the small trash can in the corner of her room. They buried it under nondescript floral patterns. Good riddance. She turned away from the heap. This John Wilder, he is so kind, so smart, and so mysterious. And now he is interested in me. She had known of him for some time. Everyone knew about his accomplishments in cross-country. His endurance and dramatic finishes were legendary. He even crawled to win a race once after collapsing a few feet from the finish line. But no one knew him really. When he wasn't trunning, he practically disappeared. He was kind of a loner. Not like the other boys at all, and this is what attracted her. The icky dress fell to the floor for the last time, and joined the pile in the corner. She changed into jeans and a halter, and sat in front of the vanity, brushing her hair as she hummed. It felt so good running the stiff bristles over her scalp and down through her long black shining mane. It sent prickly waves of pleasure all through her. Her flesh stood up as she reveled in the radiant surging energy running up and down her body. She filled her hands with her hair and put her face in it, breathing in the sweet smell. She let it go. It cascaded down over her breasts. She shook her head and looked into in the mirror. Should I wear it down tomorrow? Yes, it's time. Lately, she'd become more concerned about her withdrawn condition than about the tragedy that had caused it. That knock on the head from John Wilder must have been fate. It's time for me to get on with my. Suddenly there was a crash and the whole house shook. Devi jumped up and ran out through the living room and out the front door. In the yard, wedged between the big live oak tree and the corner of the house, was her father's Bronco. Charles Duran was slumped over the wheel. Oh my God. She ran over, hair flying, and yanked open the door. Papa. Papa. Are you all right? She pulled him carefully off the wheel and leaned him back against the seat. He began to move, turning his head slowly toward her. Well, hello, darlin'. Did you hear me park? His breath was strong with whiskey. Papa. Don't you know you shouldn't drive when you've been drinking? But how'll I get home to you, darlin'? I'll come and get you. Just have someone call. Whatever you say, dear. Papa, that's what you said last time when you nearly drove into the waterway. What am I going to do with you? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You deserve better than me. Now quit that. You know I love you and will always take care of you, but you have to help. She hauled him down out of the truck and held him up as she navigated crookedly across the yard. Charles Duran was a burly tugboat captain, and twice his daughter's size. She nearly collapsed under his weight as they staggered through the front door. They made it to his recliner in the living room and she unrolled him into it like a rug. In half a minute he was sound asleep. Early the next morning, Charles Duran sat at the breakfast table with a headache, sipping hot coffee and looking ashamed. Devi came in, all ready for school. She had on an attractive skirt and blouse. Her hair danced down her shoulders like black rain. The glasses were gone, replaced by a modest amount of makeup. She didn't need much. Smell. She let it go. It cascaded down over her breasts. She shook her head and looked into in the mirror. Should I wear it down tomorrow? Yes, it's time. Lately, she'd become more concerned about her withdrawn condition than about the tragedy that had caused it. That knock on the head from John Wilder must have been fate. It's time for me to get on with my. Suddenly there was a crash and the whole house shook. Devi jumped up and ran out through the living room and out the front door. In the yard, wedged between the big live oak tree and the corner of the house, was her father's Bronco. Charles Duran was slumped over the wheel. Oh my God. She ran over, hair flying, and yanked open the door. Papa. Papa. Are you all right? She pulled him carefully off the wheel and leaned him back against the seat. He began to move, turning his head slowly toward her. Well, hello, darlin'. Did you hear me park? His breath was strong with whiskey. Papa. Don't you know you shouldn't drive when you've been drinking? But how'll I get home to you, darlin'? I'll come and get you. Just have someone call. Whatever you say, dear. Papa, that's what you said last time when you nearly drove into the waterway. What am I going to do with you? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You deserve better than me. Now quit that. You know I love you and will always take care of you, but you have to help. She hauled him down out of the truck and held him up as she navigated crookedly across the yard. Charles Duran was a burly tugboat captain, and twice his daughter's size. She nearly collapsed under his weight as they staggered through the front door. They made it to his recliner in the living room and she unrolled him into it like a rug. In half a minute he was sound asleep. Early the next morning, Charles Duran sat at the breakfast table with a headache, sipping hot coffee and looking ashamed. Devi came in, all ready for school. She had on an attractive skirt and blouse. Her hair danced down her shoulders like black rain. The glasses were gone, replaced by a modest amount of makeup. She didn't need much. You are beautiful, darlin', he said. You're always beautiful, especially today. Thank you, Papa, she said. I need some clothes. Do you mind if I drive to the mall after school and charge a few things? He paused, looking into the brown mug. Yeah, go. I'm so happy to see you dressing up again. You haven't done that since your mother and brother went out that night. He stopped himself, putting the cup back up to his mouth. It's okay, Papa, she said. I just think it's time to get on with our lives, don't you? I do, but it's hard, you know. Yeah, she said. It's hard. She wished she could give him what he needed to go on. But it had to come from inside him. She knew that now. There was no way she'd be wanting to get to know John Wilder if there wasn't something in her that wanted to live, pulling her out of her grief and depression. Her father hadn't found it yet. She hoped he would. "I'll be here for you, Papa. Please don't drink after you get back tonic today. Promise me." "I'll try," he said, visibly trying to shake off his hangover. "We've got a big cruise ship comin' in and they'll be needin' an extra tug. I may be late." Devi prayed he'd come home sober. "I'll have dinner on the stove for you," she said. She got up, kissed him, and went out. As she drove to school she was tingling with anticipation. "I wonder if John will recognize me."